So we are going to begin this quarterly webinar with the Financial Data Exchange. And we're excited for those of you that are joining this morning or this midday afternoon, wherever you find yourself, that you've taken the time to learn a little bit more about the Financial Data Exchange and specifically the 5 consumer-centric principles that the Financial Data Exchange has been built around. Today, I'm going to act a bit as a moderator for this webinar, and I'm joined today by Anthony Burton with Wells Fargo and with Tim Clemmer, who is with EEI, and we're going to introduce ourselves here in just a bit when we talk through some of the 5 principles. Next slide. So today, here's our agenda. We're going to go a little bit over the mission and objectives of the organization, and we're going to talk a little bit about FDX, how it came about. We're just over a year old now as an organization, and then we're really going to focus in on the 5 principles. Next slide. For those who may be new to FDX, what FDX is all about, at the heart and soul of this organization is taking the entire financial data ecosystem. So this includes financial institutions and banks and investment houses that may hold consumer data through accounts. It also includes data aggregators who often act as the infrastructure or the piping, and then the fintechs.
In general, FDX as an organization is moving the financial data ecosystem away from screen scraping and held away login credentials to API access to financial data. At its heart and at its core, this means that consumer financial data is more secure, more reliable, and consumers have more control over what data they share and knowing exactly where it's going and for how long and for what purpose. FDX is also developing a certification program and an operating framework for the organization, and membership, for those who are considering joining, is tiered. We have tiered membership opportunities all up and down for the smallest financial institution up to the largest. And so we certainly encourage you to come check us out. So in terms of who FDX is, as you can see from this slide, the FDX board includes 24 organizations that really represent a who's who of the financial industry. Some of the largest financial institutions and banks, some of the largest data aggregators, and then other permission parties where consumers often permission their data and the end user of that data. We also have several industry groups that are present, and ultimately FDX is under the umbrella and an independent subsidiary of the FS-ISAC. Where we're going, we talked a little bit about the FDX core mission is moving away from screen scraping to API access. The chosen FDX API is already in production. It's been around for quite a while, and we are already at about 5.25 million users as of this fall. And the projection is that we could be at 12 million users by the spring. If you think about the total universe of consumers and bank accounts, a rough estimate is between 40 and 50 million consumers have used fintech apps and given up their login credentials through screen scraping. So this represents 12 million by the spring, almost a 25% move to API access. So we really are moving the needle as an organization. In terms of who's using them and how they're using the FDX API, this is a survey of the membership of FDX, about 73 organizations right now. And it shows kind of where we are. So 58% of our organizations that are members already have the FDX API in use. I think one thing to consider is nobody rolls out everything overnight. And so some of these are in pilot projects, some of these are segmented into specific accounts. But really we see in development and plans within 6 to 12 months, most of our members are there. Who is FDX? If you're an organization that's joining us today and thinking about joining, this gives you a sense of kind of our members based on revenue, as well as our members based on industry sector. Again, we say often we're a big tent. We're a diverse tent, really the entire financial data ecosystem. So please join us. This gives a little bit of a history. As I mentioned, the FDX API is not brand new. It's been around for a while. It's been rebranded from DDA, the Durable Data API, which was under the stewardship of the FS-ISAC for many years. FDX launched in last October. We're just over a year old, and we've already brought the OFX standard underneath the FDX API, and so you can see kind of where we're going and truly beginning to be a global reach as an organization. This gives you a little bit of understanding of where the consumer is for financial data sharing. When you think about, when consumers think about downloading an app, maybe it's a budgeting app, maybe they're using tax preparation software, maybe they've already looked into a digital mortgage application. Many consumers are at least engaging for the first time for a fintech app. Up to a third of consumers in the US have used at least one. But 89%, rightly so, are concerned about their data privacy and data sharing. They're willing to share this data, but they want to be sure and they want to know that it has proper controls in place. And that's really where FDX is going. This is really where we want to sit and camp out a bit today in terms of the 5 principles for consumer data sharing. FDX has been working as an organization, again, with the entire data ecosystem to really move the needle in a couple of areas. And control, access, transparency, traceability, and security are our 5 pillars. So now I want to bring in Anthony Burton, who's with Wells Fargo, and Tim Clemmer, who's with EEI, just to talk broadly, Anthony and Tim, a little bit about why you're a part of FDX and where you've seen value from the organization. And then we're going to talk a little bit about each of these 5 principles and how we see them interacting in the marketplace.
Sure, I'll start. Anthony Burton from Wells Fargo. I lead our digital data API product team. We've been, or me personally, and Wells Fargo have been part of this group since the DDA spec was being developed, and our very first API was actually built off that spec, and it's evolved over time, obviously. We've seen, we've seen a huge benefit for being part of FDX as Wells Fargo saw a lot of the issues that Tom's already highlighted on our side, and it's great to see that we have a forum and a consortium of others who see those same things and can collectively attack these things, as a group. For us, it's so much better than doing anything in a vacuum, and you get so much good feedback from hearing all the different viewpoints from not only other FIs from our standpoint, but also the data aggregators and other consumer groups as well. So, we've been on this journey for a while now, and really we're at the point where we're kind of really turning a corner and making this a bit more of a mature offering for us. But FDX has been a great help for us so far.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Anthony. So I'm Tim Clemmer, head of open banking for EEI. We've been implementing and certifying the FDX API for the last several years, working with some of the largest banks, including Wells Fargo and Anthony, and some of the larger fintechs. To us, this is a great spec to sort of take a stand on and to standardize on. We appreciate the relationships that we've found at FDX, and EEI has been around for about 25 years, and we were one of the original architects of the OFX API, as you saw on a previous slide, which was the sort of ancestor of all this. And I think we feel very important. It's very important to stay in touch with this and to have a hand in its design and its future and its forward-looking path. By virtue of working with all of these different companies and standing in the middle and listening to all the different concerns, we bring another voice to the table. And we can help represent the consumer as well as the financial institution and the data aggregators and fintechs.
Thanks so much, Anthony and Tim. Let's go to the next slide and kind of really tick through each of these 5 principles, see how they work in the marketplace. So control, you saw that slide at the beginning of the presentation with the consumer really in the middle of their own data. FDX believes that consumers should be able to permission their financial data for any services or applications they choose. This is really the core principle, is that the consumer owns their own data and should be able to use it however they choose. So Anthony, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of where you see control in terms of a consumer permissioning their own data through the lens of your role at Wells Fargo.
Sure. So let's give you a quick walkthrough of our product. And you know, in the screen scraping world, if a customer wants to connect their Wells Fargo data, they just hand over their credentials to a data aggregator or a fintech app that may be scraping directly, and everything that's available within online banking is theoretically you know, available to that aggregator or fintech, even if maybe there's some data that's not necessarily applicable for the application that the consumer is using. So, you know, their only really real recourse to deal with that, if they didn't want to share that level of data, it would be just to remove their credentials or delete their account. And that's also not a great experience. Obviously, the customer wants to use these applications. So moving to our product, instead of just dropping your credentials over to that app, the app will redirect you to Wells, or redirect the user to the Wells Fargo experience, where they'll authenticate, and then they'll have actually the list of accounts and data that they can share. And so it gives them choice and control up front, and so that, you know, they can be much more surgical about the data that they're sharing. And then once they've done that, after the fact, Wells Fargo actually has a branded product called Control Tower, where the customer can always update those selections that were made on the front end after the fact as well. So we give the customer control on the front and back end. It's a much better experience. We've gotten great feedback from our customers for just having that ability alone. But even if some of them just, you know, are fine permissioning all of that data, but just knowing that that's there has been a huge benefit for our customers. We've gotten great feedback on it, and you know, it's a great step for the consumer, for the bank, and for the applications, as everything is being used contextually and appropriately.
Yeah, to take it another step, to kind of look at it from I'm the consumer point of view, it's what Anthony said, and the example that I like to use is, you know, I'm a small business owner. I've got my accounts at Wells Fargo because they're so great. I've got my small business accounts there. I've got my payroll. I may have one or two personal accounts and maybe some of my kids' accounts. And now I find this great new app called mybigbucks.com, and I hand them over my credentials because I want to do something. I want to see my net worth and I want to see how things are going. And I'm a little bit surprised and taken aback when I go onto mybigbanks.com after I've given them my credentials and I see my business accounts and my payroll accounts and my kids' accounts. And it's like, no, this is not what I want to share. And this is where it becomes very important with FDX to standardize and say we want to initiate and have these controls in place, because I need to be able to control who's getting my data. And I want to be able to say, okay, mybigbucks.com, you can have my personal accounts, but I don't want you to know or even know about my kids' accounts or my business accounts or any of that. And so it's very important to be able to permission who gets what data, and for me to know that I have control. It makes me sleep well at night knowing that these guys are only seeing what I want them to see. And I can split that across multiple applications. So if I'm going to a small business accounting package, they can have my payroll and my business. And if I want to do something with my kids, I can keep that quiet. No one has to know. And so that's where I think control is important. And I think it really becomes important as a buy-in factor for consumers. When they see that they can have control, I think it makes it easier for them to understand open banking and to buy into it.
Thanks. What I really like about both of your perspectives, and certainly what I have heard from policymakers and regulators when we talk about the financial data exchange, is the fact that it's not just control and permission on the front end of choosing, Tim, as you said, kind of which accounts and for what purposes. But Anthony, also kind of what Wells Fargo is experiencing on the back end, which is, what about that app that I downloaded? I really thought I would use. I really planned to be a better budgeter, but then 2 weeks later I decided maybe not, and I forgot about it. And so the ability on a dashboard to see, oh, I'm actually still sharing data with a fintech app that maybe I don't want to anymore. And so really both ends of control, I think, are critical and important there.
And let me add this other piece to it, because part of the whole control aspect is an evolutionary journey, if you will. And when we first started working with the banks and putting them onto FDX, basically they were doing what was happening in screen scraping. All the accounts went over. Wells was one of the first to offer account level controls, where you were presented with, I was presented with my 10 accounts and I was able to click off, I only want to share these 3. Plus I had the further ability to say any future accounts are either automatically added or not added. And that was important. Then it started to take, and Wells is part of this too, I call it evolutionary phase 2, where now we're defining different scopes of data. So do you want to share financial data? Do you want to share personal account details? Do you want to share tax data? That starts to make me feel even more comfortable that I have more control over what's being shared. And I think that helps buy in too.
Yeah, thanks so much for that added clarity. Let's go to our next slide on access. So one of the core principles that really began at the founding of the Financial Data Exchange is this belief that the consumer does, in fact, own their data. This was memorialized in the Dodd-Frank Act, Section 1033, basically requires financial institutions to make their data available to consumers. But there's always a bit of a tension there in terms of making sure that the consumer is actually aware and permissioning their data, and then kind of the security around that data. So I wonder, Anthony, maybe if you could start again in talking a little bit about kind of the critical aspect of giving consumer access, but the way that the FDX API is bettering that access to really truly make it a more secure ecosystem.
Yeah. So from a Wells standpoint, we definitely saw prior to even the DDA spec and FDX, we definitely saw the risks with screen scraping, and we only kind of looked at it from the FI point of view initially, and there was a lot, there's a high volume of requests that are coming in through our website that are coming from data aggregators and fintechs, and it was kind of negatively viewed at that time, years ago, and we've evolved over time, because really the underlying message was our customers wanted to use these applications, right? We weren't forcing them to do that. The aggregators weren't just coming in and doing it on their own. Our customers, wanted this level of access, off property. And so I think the question was, where we kind of turned, or we pivoted internally, was say, okay, we respect the fact that our customers want this level of access. Now let's do it more securely, because screen scraping is definitely brittle, and from an info security standpoint, a data breach standpoint, it fires off a lot of red flags, obviously, within the financial institutions. So when we moved to our product at Wells, it was, hey, how do we do this in a secure manner, but also give our customers their data portability, and so it kind of touches on some of the aspects I previously talked to with giving our customers a little bit more control. But now their customers are no longer having to share their credentials with a third-party application. We tokenize the credentials and the data that they've permissioned to that app and or data aggregator, and so the security from our standpoint is way better, even more beneficial to the user, is that the APIs, the data validity is so much better and cleaner, so that the aggregator is getting better data. The customer doesn't see any kind of failure points anymore with that occasionally occur with screen scraping. And from our standpoint, we're securing that data from the FI. So to me, it's always, like I always say this, it's a win-win-win for everybody to move this path. So we as we continue to evolve, to Tim's point earlier, as we're getting more refined with use cases and scopes, we're getting even more surgical with the level of access to give to our customers. But when we start with it going down the FDX path, that's sort of laying the groundwork for much better experiences going forward as we partner with data aggregators and consumer groups to give our customers what they really want.
Yeah, it's funny. This whole thing about access, just the first thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about it is the number of hours of conference calls I was on with Anthony, with the fintechs, and with everybody, because the whole thing was about how do we provide the best, most positive customer experience, right? This is all about customer experience. You can't hide this stuff from them. You've got to be able to get in there very quickly and access the access this ease of use factor. And the problem is, the easier you make it, the more difficult it is to develop. It looks from the front end, oh, piece of cake. I just click on Wells Fargo's control tower. I'm there. Here's my page. The amount of security and the amount of checks and balances and compliance and regulatory that goes on behind it is, just levels of complexity on top of it. So access is kind of an interesting one, and it's a nuanced version to me of control, because with access, one of the important things is the ability to revoke those permissions, right? One of the things that we found in a couple of surveys that just surprised the hell out of me, and the biggest group, or the most offending group, was like the millennials and the 30-year-olds, was, I think it's 35%, 37% of those surveyed thought that deleting an app from their phone stopped data collection. And the answer is like, hello, ixnay on that, guys. That's not how it works. You've got to go in and change your password or do something, right? So this helps them see all that, because then it becomes very easy and it's very obvious, like, hey, if you want to stop data collection, you come back to us here, and this is where you revoke. And when you see it on their screen, like the Wells screen is a very nicely done job there, that, hey, you come to Control Tower, here are all the applications that have access to your data, this is which accounts that have access, and here's the revoke button. And it's very easy. And so now my access is simpler. And again, it's given me confidence in open banking.
Right. Yeah, no, I really appreciate the way you both frame that up. We're going to move over to transparency. Tim, I'm going to let you start us off. Right before we get into that, though, if you are on the webinar and have a question you would like to submit, please use the chat function. And then at the end of the webinar, we will take several questions and answer those from those that are joining us. So let's talk about transparency. To me, transparency is really the intersection of everything that we're talking about, because we really want to hang our hats on user permission data, that nothing that flows through the FDX API is data that hasn't been user permission. So the consumer is directing this. They are, again, controlling this. You're giving the consumer access to their data. But without transparency, the question is, what is permission? What is the consumer actually consenting to? What are they aware of? And so one of the elements of the FDX API that I'm most excited about is really bringing more transparency to bear, so that the consumer knows exactly what data they're sharing, who they're sharing it with, for what purpose, and for how long. And I know there's a lot of work that's going into that with some of the FDX committees and working groups. So Tim, I wonder if you could just talk about your perspective on transparency. This is a challenging topic, but I also think everybody agrees it's one that we really have to tackle.
Oh, it's huge. And you don't know that you need it until you're faced with it, right? Until you understand some of the underpinnings of what goes on. So if we go back to my example of mybigbucks.com, there are thousands of these companies out there, and they're marvelous companies. They're great companies. But, mybigbucks.com may have 7 to 11 developers. They don't have, their focus is making mybigbucks.com the most awesome site on the web. They don't have the wherewithal, the bandwidth to interface with 16,000 different financial institutions across the US. So I guess I'd call it the dirty little secret behind it, is we have data aggregators whose job it is to interface with the 16,000 institutions, and then mybigbucks.com contracts to them to get their data. Well, in transparency, we're already working with some people or some financial institutions, that when you get to that access page and you say, hey, I want to share, oh, Tim, you're about to share your data with mybigbucks.com, but be aware that there's an aggregator, aggregator.com is sitting in the middle, and they're going to use your data and pass it on to mybigbucks.com. That helps me understand what's going on and who's doing it. And the other thing with transparency that I think is critical and crucial, and again, these were long conversations that I was sitting in on with Wells Fargo and a bunch of other banks, and they involved the legal people, and that is these pages that are being set up in the workflow to sign up for sharing. There's no 8 or 20 pages of legalese anymore. What they're trying to do in very simple, straightforward 2, 3, 4 sentences is say, hey, Tim, you're about to share your checking and savings accounts with mybigbucks.com through the use of a data aggregator called, bigaggregator.com. And you will be sharing your data until you turn it off by clicking this box over here, and come back to us via control tower or whatever. That kind of simplistic instructions is huge for the consumer. Again, it's all about instilling confidence.
It's great. Anthony, do you have some thoughts on transparency kind of from the FI side?
Yeah, for sure. In the screen scraping world, when you're giving your credentials and your scrape, and what that happens within the app, and I think that the customer will see, from our standpoint, the Wells Fargo logo, and believes that there's a direct connection, similar to what we're trying to do here with FDX. But I think there's something that's even better about getting redirected from the app, and then you land on the financial institution property, and to Tim's point earlier, it's saying, hey, you're going to share the following data with, such and such app. Seeing that from your actual financial institution, and saying that we will do this on behalf of your instructions to us. I think number one is it gives a better feeling for the customer of security. It's more transparent in the way that we're sharing the data and our role that we're playing in it as well. And then beyond that, after we've gone through that, we will send out a notification with the customer, so they also have an email, a tracking mechanism to say, okay, here's this fully was completed. Wells is now sharing my data with such and such. One of the great things about FDX is that one of the kind of like latest things that's being worked on is the concept of a data receipt, and that's sort of where we're targeting our next year roadmap, is to really evolve that email notification that goes out to not just say, hey, you're sharing data with such and such, but say, here's exactly the data that we're sharing, here's the data we're not sharing. And that's something that is much more powerful, I think, for the user, and credit to FDX for bringing that to the table. I think it's something that everybody is on board with, from the financial institution all the way to the aggregators. I think that kind of core to all of this, not just with access and control, is that full transparency and giving that customer, effectively a transcript of exactly what they're sharing, and something that they can reference at any time.
Yeah,
right.
Totally agree.
No, yeah, and I think this is hard work. Trying to figure out. I was just in a congressional hearing where FDX was testifying, and the members of Congress were kind of reeling off a few links of privacy policies and terms and conditions of some common fintech apps. And it was 20 page, 30 pages, 40 pages. And so really doing the hard work to figure out how do you bring this information to the consumer in a way that they really are going to take time to engage it and understand it and think about it. And so I think it's both kind of the technical side that FDX is working on, but really a cultural shift in the whole financial industry to say it's important for consumers to really understand and know this. Let's move on. I know we want to leave some time for questions at the end if we have any, to talk about traceability. I know I here, in my role as kind of leading the government affairs task force here for the Financial Data Exchange, we hear an awful lot from regulators about trying to figure out how do you know if that data, if a consumer permissions their data outside the walls of their financial institution, how do you know if there is a loss or a breach in some way, where it was lost, or who's responsible, and how do you kind of create that chain of command, both to give the consumer a lot more confidence about kind of how their data is being handled and where it's going, but in the same way to take some of the friction out of the industry to know kind of where that breach took place. So I don't know if either of you kind of have some thoughts on traceability, what goes into that, and kind of what's ahead for FDX on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so actually, traceability is a pretty big topic just within our walls, even not just for the consumer, but for Wells as well. You know, if even folks that we've got, you know, partner agreements with regards to our APIs, and I'll just say, you know, you'll have data aggregators that are out there who, you know, to Tim's point earlier, are kind of the middleman to the fintech app, and making sure that that's being, you know, exposed and transparent to the customer is one thing. But where it gets kind of you know, a little complicated in the world that we live in today is that you actually will have aggregators of aggregators, right? So it's not just you know, one hop to that fintech app. There could be kind of this daisy chain of flows before before you get to the application that the customer is actually interfacing with, and trying to figure out, you know, that's kind of the balance that we have to play is how much information is overwhelming information to a customer. We want to know it for sure, because, you know, if
right.
We've got a data aggregator who's in good standing and it is doing great, but maybe they have one aggregator that they're shipping data to, you know, down the path that, you know, we find out there's some breaches at or something like that. We obviously want to know that so that we can be surgical with addressing the problem, and it's not some, you know, we're not having to do anything with a blunt instrument. But at the same time, I think the customer, from the customer standpoint, does the customer care to know the 7 steps that gets there? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. So that's one of those things that we're trying to figure out, you know, what's that balance of the right level of information that doesn't just kind of overwhelm and swamp our customers, even though we from a Wells Fargo standpoint absolutely want to know that full traceability.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because we could have used traceability when we were testing with Wells and all the other banks, because we would go, think about going into production. We would go into production, and I'm not going to say who the offending bank was, but we were having massive amount of failures going through the OAuth workflow. And
right.
because, you know, we had the bank had their little IDs and things, and the fintech had their IDs, but none of the IDs matched anything. So it was like, we need some sort of piece of information on that will pass all the way through, or that, you know, as you're passing data, you tag it so that we know what's going on. And the example that I like to give is like, all right, so just so we don't point fingers at anybody, but, you know, a lightning strikes some internet hub, and all of a sudden during a data transfer, all zeros become nines, you know. Now I'm sitting here at mybigbucks.com, which is feeding a credit app, and now all of my payments, rather than being on time, look like they're 99 days late because all the dates got squashed and all the zeros became nines. Now I'm screaming because all of a sudden I can't get that auto loan I wanted. My rates are through the roof. Somebody wants to change my credit card rates because my credit just plummeted 150 points. You need to be able to go back to my financial institution, and I'm not going to say Wells Fargo here because I like them and they didn't cause the problem, but then find, oh my God, it was lightning striking the hub, no one's at issue, just resend the data, replace it, and everything's fixed. But you've got to be able to get to an answer. If we're going to instill confidence, we've got to be able to fix issues and errors quickly. You can't wait weeks. You can't wait, you know, you can't wait days. They've got to happen within a day, within hours.
No, I like that point, because it's, I think a lot of times we focus on traceability just from the standpoint of kind of a major loss or a major breach. But even, the beginning of this webinar, right? We had some audio problems. We're not starting off great, right? So traceability helps us make sure and really meet that consumer demand. They download an app. I don't know what the amount of time is, but it's got to be minutes to say, is this working? I need this to work. I want this to work. And so traceability helps us make sure that we kind of work all the kinks out in the system. I like that approach. All right, let's go to our last principle, which is security. Obviously, at the core of any kind of consumer confidence building organization in the financial data sharing ecosystem is the notion that my data is going to be secure. Certainly today in the marketplace where screen scraping is still alive and well, FDX is really doing a lot of work to move to that API standard, but until we fully get there, and even in an API world, that kind of secure holding of data at rest is really, really important. I know Wells Fargo, I know everybody cares a great deal about this. We have different regulatory regimes really bring this into clearer focus. So Anthony, I wonder if you could lead off and just talk about kind of the security expectations Wells has, and then where have you seen FDX kind of bolster that?
Sure. Well, obviously the sort of low-hanging fruit on security is getting credentials out of the marketplace initially, right? So just moving from credentials being shared with third parties to now an OAuth token that tokenizes that customer and their entitlements to that application is a huge step in the right direction. There's also, when we move that traffic from our online banking website over to our API channel, that's actually, sort of in a kind of indirect way, or actually not super indirect, but actually somewhat direct, making our online banking even more secure, right? So, I mean, if there was ever, we have such a high volume of requests coming in from data aggregators that, it sometimes can degrade, very rarely at this point, but I mean, back in the days when this was sort of burgeoning and new, it would sometimes just degrade the online banking, experience for our customers. And so it's, shifting that traffic to where it should be from an API if we're going to be transferring data. It makes not just the tokenization side of things more secure, but also the actual data delivery as well. So it's not just being scraped through our website; it's actually coming to a mutually authenticated channel through our API, our Wells Fargo Gateway API channel. So I think that beyond that, when instead of it having a customer or an aggregator going in and logging into the website on the front side, we have certificates that we grant to each aggregator we have a partnership with. So that means so we know it's only that partner that's coming in to get that data. It's not just a new website or a new IP address that's coming through our front door that all of a sudden we didn't know about and we need to whitelist or whatever not. It's only on these certified connections that are coming and getting the data, and then the customer obviously also has their level of control. So that's even more of a kind of a day-to-day security that the customer always has the ability to turn anything off if they wanted to. So all of this from from our standpoint, from a security standpoint, and how FDX has helped with all of this is, just helping to validate all of this and really kind of giving us the standard and the the sort of marching orders, so to speak, of how to address this. I mean, I think, like I said earlier, if Wells Fargo was to do this in a vacuum, there would be so much that we're missing. So FDX as a forum and as a leadership group of really helping direct us and give us a lot of good kind of back and forth feedback for folks who really concentrate on this at each FI and obviously aggregators are wholly concentrated on this, but not everyone in Wells Fargo knows this space, and so when you have these conversations with those folks, there's a lot of teaching that we have to do to make them understand. When we have sort of our like parties over at FDX, it makes that conversation much more fruitful and more efficient as well. So FDX has been a huge help for us, or just helping to evolve and push us down the right path here.
Great, Tim, give us your thoughts.
Yeah, as we talk about security, security is one of those things that, again, you don't think about it until you need it or until it happens and you're there. But I was thinking, like, as a kid, when you walk into a bank and you see that 15-foot circular door, 3 feet thick, and it's swinging closed, and all the locks and stuff, that made me feel that my $16.72 was, safe, at that bank. Well, it's the same
Right.
thing that we have to kind of instill and in effect sell to the customers, because the amount of security that's going into open banking is enormous. And it's not just data in motion and data at rest that we've talked about, or even the tokens, but think about each and every fintech has to register with the FI. And there's all sorts of sharing of secrets and IDs and API keys and all this, to ensure that when, mybigbucks.com comes to Wells Fargo to get Tim Clemmer's data, Wells Fargo can prove without a second doubt that, oh yeah, that's mybigbucks.com, and oh yeah, this token is Tim Clemmer, and I can, decrypt it and do all that. There's a lot of security going on. And as Anthony says, we've been in some of these meetings and some of the working groups and stuff. Some of the ideas that are coming out are marvelous. They're great ideas. Some of them may be a little much to try to implement, but they're great ideas, and people are actually thinking about what's the best client experience, and that's what we're all shooting for, right? We all want for the best client experience, and the best client experience means that nothing bad happens.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And I really appreciate, Tim, I think you talked about being a kid and walking in. I had the same experience. What's behind that big door?
Right.
Oh, that's where all the money is. It means it's safe. You think about even the generation behind us who has not really had that experience, but still wants that same feeling of security. And so how can we build really a culture of security around financial data sharing? And I think that's really at the heart of FDX.
But you know what, Tom?
You
know what? Let me just say this. What I worry about, though, is with these future generations, is they're not thinking in those terms, right? They're assuming without thinking or without checking. And that's why I think it's incumbent upon us to ensure that this security is there at every single step of the way and at every single handoff,
Right. Yeah.
And that's where we're the custodians, right?
Yeah, totally agree. Let's go to our final slide. It does not look like we have any questions. So I just want to, and I think one more, we have some links. Yep. Just wrap up. Thanks for those of you who joined us, and thanks for putting up with 5 minutes of poor audio. My apologies for that. Listen, if you are on this webinar and you're interested in joining FDX, please visit our website at financialdataexchange.org. You see the member list there. We've put up some FAQs, just interested. You can also look at the copy of the spec on the website, as well as a white paper that really breaks out and describes some of the topics that we've been discussing today in greater detail. Otherwise, for those of you that are just stopping by, please be sure to join our next quarterly webinar. And we thank you for joining us today. And Anthony and Tim, thanks so much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Been my pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.